introduce Jeremy Klaszus. Jeremy is a Calgary writer who specializes in magazine profiles. His work has appeared in Swerve, National Geographic Traveler, The Globe and Mail, Reader's Digest, Alberta Views, and other publications. In 2010, he ghost-wrote a best-selling memoir, which I've read, with the legendary Western singer Ian Tyson. The Long Trail is the title of the book. It's a great book. You should all pick it up. And his magazine writing has been recognized with numerous national and regional awards. Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Heather. This is going to be a great session. Hopefully you can all hear me. I will speak loudly. Let me know if you are having troubles at all. Yeah, talk about writing profiles. This is going to be exciting. They're one of my favorite kinds of stories to write, and I think, like lots of people, as a magazine writer, they're one of my favorite stories in magazines to read. And that's not to downplay stories that are about issues and that kind of thing. But with profiles, you really have an opportunity as a writer to connect with your reader on a deeper level, on an emotional level, and in a way that can really move them. So we're going to go through how to do this. And I've been doing this for a while, and I've figured out a process that more or less works. It's always a challenge when you actually have to get down to the writing, but I've figured out some techniques that get me past the finish line. And so we're going to go over three main things: interviewing, research, and writing and getting beyond that cloud of depression and lack of self-confidence which settles on all of us when we're trying to tackle a story like this. Starting out, what makes a good profile subject? You can basically break it into two different categories. The first one is people who are prominent or controversial figures. So like this could be a politician, it could be an athlete or a musician, or Chris Hadfield currently would be a good example of this. And with this kind of story, you have an opportunity to tell the story behind the story. What makes this person tick? That's often how I describe profile stories. What you're really getting at is what makes this person tick. But the other category, to be honest, I find even more compelling, and as a writer and a researcher, I enjoy it more. That's ordinary people who have lived through interesting struggles, and people who are not used to the media limelight and who don't look at their lives and think, you know, I'm a star. Everything I do is so important, and I really enjoy working with those people. Let's start at the very beginning. So you've figured out you want to write about somebody. Where do you start? Usually where I start is just by reading everything I can about that person. I want to read newspaper articles. I want to read magazine stories. I want to read, anything that's online, and I just want to absorb as much as possible about this person and get a sense of what's been written about them already. Part of the thing is I want to get a sense of what's already been written, so I'm not duplicating or I'm not taking things in the same direction that another magazine writer has already done. I want to bring something distinct, and at the same time, I don't want to be researching stuff that's already been researched. In a way, you can have other people do your work for you if you look at what's already been written. Oh, sorry, I meant to advance my slide there, but there you go. Now, I'm going to recommend two things. If you have access to InfoMart, that is a very useful tool for looking up newspaper articles about somebody. And it's a subscription service, but if you or the publication you're writing for has access to it, it's very, very helpful. Also, you can do Canadian Newsstand through your local library. And that is a little more cumbersome to use. but does more or less the same thing. You can search newspaper archives. If you only take one thing away from this webinar, it is get away from Microsoft Word. Do not use Microsoft Word. If you're doing a long magazine project, like a profile story, you need a word processor that'll be better than Microsoft Word, where you can access all of the material, where you can access your interview transcripts, your audio files, PDFs, all that kind of stuff. And I discovered Scrivener probably about 5 years ago, and I'm kind of a Scrivener evangelist now, so I apologize for that. But honestly, it can help you immensely. And I have an example here from one of my projects. And if you take a look here, you can see in the left-hand column that I've got all my drafts for my story. I've got PDFs in there. I've got my transcriptions. I've got my audio files. I use this program to transcribe tape. Makes it quite easy to manage everything all in one place. And it just gives you a way to organize your material in a way that won't totally drive you crazy. So Scrivener, look it up and take advantage. Let's start out, let's move on to interviewing. When you're working on a profile story, you know, when I'm going into a project, I know that I'm going to want to talk to whoever it is I'm interviewing numerous times. But I don't disclose that at the beginning because nobody will agree to that. If I say, you know, I'm going to talk to you 5 or 7 times over the next 2 months, no one in their right mind would say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I have lots of time for that. But that's kind of the game plan I have in my head. I know that if I want to do a good job on this profile story, I've got to spend some time. And I break down the interview process into 3 stages, and we'll go over what those 3 stages are. Starting out with arranging the first interview, first thing you have to do is obviously connect with your subject, and this can be easier with some people than others. If you're just connecting with somebody who is, you know, not a media personality or a politician or somebody like that, it's fairly easy. If you're going through communications departments, it can be more difficult. The way I get through that hurdle is just by showing earnest interest and saying, you know what, I want to write about this person and here's why, and I give as much information as I can and be as forthcoming as I can about what I'm working on and why I want to do it. Curiosity is a very good asset throughout this whole process, and you want to show that throughout the process. For the first interview, I often ask the subject where they would like to meet. And it can have interesting results. Sometimes it's not interesting. Sometimes it's just come to my office or something like that. Sometimes it's, oh yeah, let's go to a favorite restaurant that I like. I can remember working on a story about Rick McIver, who ran for mayor in Calgary in the last municipal election. He's now the transportation minister in Alberta, but at the time he was running for mayor. And I was setting out to do a profile story on him, and I said, you know, where do you want to meet? Like, what's a favorite spot of yours? And he picked this steakhouse at a strip mall in southwest Calgary, and it was just so, it was perfect. It was just so him and so true to his style and who he is and all that stuff. And so when we were there, I'm making notes of what this place is like. He's in his element, all this stuff. And it gives you material that you can weave into your story later on. And you may or may not do that. Sorry, I'm just looking at the question here. Who pays for the meal or the coffee at the restaurant? Andrea, that's a good question. And actually, I do it. I pay for myself. I don't pay for him, and I don't let him pay for me, just because, I don't know, I prefer to keep that line. And this first interview is not comprehensive. And when I go into it, I'm not thinking I need everything for my story here. I'm not thinking I need to, remember every question and get everything all tied up. It's quite the opposite, actually. I go into it thinking, I want to build trust with this person. And in fact, what ends up happening often is I let the other person steer the interview. I'll go in with some fairly broad questions, but they might take it in another direction entirely. And in this first interview, I allow that to happen. I don't get in the way at all. And this is because I want to see where they take it. I want to see what tangents they go on. I want to see, where they might want to steer the story. And this is a great book. If you can get your hands on this book, it's excellent. The New Journalism. It's a bunch of interviews with American magazine writers about what they do. And this is William Langevici, who writes for Vanity Fair. And I love this. He was asked about his reporting method, and this was his answer. I listen to people very carefully. The secret is let the guy talk. You never know where they are going, and it gets really interesting when you let people run on. Every once in a while, they say something that makes me want to stop them. Wait, tell me more about that, but I resist that impulse because I might lose the jewels that are about to fall from their lips. And I love that, and that's very much, that's very useful. And so, it takes intentionality to show restraint, to not just unload with a bunch of questions and let them speak. And the other thing it does is it lets them feel like they have some degree of control and they have a role in the process, and it builds trust. Going into this first interview, though, I do need some questions to start with, and like I say, I go in with very, very broad questions. One thing I'll often say to people if I'm writing about a specific experience that's happened in somebody's life, I'll just say, where does this story start for you? And then they'll launch into their story. Who has seen you change or grow the most? How do you think you've changed or grown the most? What have you taken away from this experience? And then I always end by asking, who else do you think I should talk to for my story? And again, it's all about listening. You are getting their input, and then you'll follow up on those people by contacting those people later on. I like this a lot. This is something that is used by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have interview guidelines that they give out to people who are recording oral history of Holocaust survivors. And so they've got a guidebook, and if you can look it up, it's very valuable. It's specific to that particular circumstance, but there's a lot that applies to writing and interviewing at the same time. Genuine listening means that the interviewer hears the contours of the story as it is being told. Often important subjects in an interviewee's story are only hinted at. The interviewer must keep a constant watch for these hints. And so that really sums up what this first interview stage is about. You're looking for clues. You're looking for a trajectory. You're paying attention to what they say, but you're also making a little note of what they don't say. What things do they shy away from? At this point, I'm not sure if anybody else has any other questions about interviewing, but if so, you can pop them in, and we can. I can do my best to answer them. Oh, we've got lots of people typing, so.
I have a question. What if you have that first interview and that's all that they want to give you, then what do you do?
Yeah, Heather. Yeah. Heather just asked, what if you have that first interview and it's all that they want to give you, or all that they will give you? Basically, if you can't get any subsequent interviews. In that case, I would adapt this strategy. You would have to be a lot more assertive and kind of mix up this process. Like, this is not an exact science. The process I'm going through assumes that you can get in touch with somebody and work with them at least 2 or 3 times. If not, what I would do is do a bunch of the other work beforehand, interview other people about this person beforehand, so that when I'm going to talk to them, I'm asking them about stuff I've come across in my research. Oh, people say this about you. What is your response to that? Okay, sure. We'll take one more here.
Okay. What are the lengths of the articles you're talking about? What's the general length for a profile?
Okay. Yeah, Andrea's good question. What are the lengths of articles you're talking about? It can vary. Usually, I would say 2,000 words or upward is usually what I end up doing for a profile story, which is quite long and is quite a luxury in our day and age. But when I go into a story like this, I want to do the story justice, and I want to be able to bring nuance and really invest in it and give it some length. So I can pass.
I'll take a question from Kathy. Kathy wants to know if you're taping the interviews when you're throughout the process.
Yeah, most definitely recording interviews, whether this is in person or over the phone. And, it depends, though. It depends what's going on. It depends how comfortable they are. If somebody gets super uncomfortable as soon as you take out a digital recorder, I would switch it off. I would put it away. I would just have a more casual conversation and then explain, okay, so for this story I do need to record, and because I'll need to transcribe this. If you're like me, you can't take good notes. If some of you probably can, and that's such a gift, because I'm hopeless at taking notes. I rely so heavily on the tape and transcribing. We'll take one more here, and then we'll move on.
So there's some questions coming in. I'll save those ones till the end. What sort of notes are you taking in this exploratory stage? So you just answered a little bit about that. Do you want to go further?
Yeah, that's a good question, Omar. I'm taking notes about what they look like. I'm taking notes about their posture. I'm taking notes about how they react to certain things, their mannerisms. I don't scribble down a lot of notes about this. To be honest, I find it difficult to multitask, basically, to pay attention to them and to what they're saying, and to write notes about how they're behaving. But I am quite intentional about making a few notes about that kind of stuff, so that so that when I'm writing, I have that stuff, I have that color, and I'm not thinking, oh, how was that person acting again? I forgot. We'll keep moving here, and we'll have time for questions throughout this. So, yeah. So you've done this first interview, and quite honestly, transcribing it and listening to it can be quite excruciating. Sometimes I do this first interview and I listen to the tape, and it's like, man, just wrap this interview up. You let this person talk on for so long, but that's important. And at this stage, I'm transcribing. I read the transcript and I'm digesting the material. And this seems like an unimportant stage. It's not very active. You're not interviewing. You're not researching. But it's very, very important, actually. And it's very key to the story to just absorb the information. I find in that first interview, it's kind of like a fire hose of information coming at you, and the brain can only absorb so much of it. So when I sit with the material, I can realize, okay, here's something to follow up on. I wonder about this. This might make a good start to the story. And then from there, keep interviewing. And who to interview when you're doing a profile story. Anytime you can access friends and family of somebody, that is ideal. Just somebody who is close to the person and can give you that insight into what makes them tick, what drives that person. This is why it's important to build trust and to show that you're willing to listen, because people are not obligated to give you access to their friends and family. And it can be actually quite disruptive in their lives, depending on what you're writing about. It can bring up emotions. It can cause turmoil, and that's something to be conscious of. If you're writing about somebody prominent, like if you're doing a profile on a politician, for example, I would adapt this strategy. I'd be talking to people who are close to that person, but not necessarily trying to go through the subject. So I'm not going through the subject saying, can I talk to people who are close to you? I'd try to get in touch with those people first. But I'd probably try to go through the person as well. You know, it depends from case to case. I want to talk to people who admire the subject, people who have seen this person do meaningful or incredible things. I also, depending on the story, want to talk to people who are critical of the subject, especially if it's a contentious person. And finally, I do want to follow up on what the interview subject told me about who to talk to. If they tell me, hey, here's some people to talk to, I follow up on that. And then keep researching. And this is so important. At this stage, you go beyond, hey, here's what I found on Google, here's what I found in newspaper articles that have already been written. I want to find emails. I want to see letters. I want to see court documents, depending on what the story is. I want to see photographs. And we're gonna go through several stories that I've worked on, and I just want to take you through examples of this kind of documentation and what it can do for your story, because it can make all the difference and add a lot to your interviews. Interviews alone often do not suffice to tell a good profile story. So this first story, this is about a World War II air bomber pilot. And he had quite a powerful story. His brother was also in the Air Force and was shot down during the war over Nazi Germany. And his brother actually, he died in this incident. And this person I was interviewing, Harold Curl, and I was writing about him, he was telling me this story. And what he did was, before he came home from the war, he went on this journey to find his brother's grave. That was very important to him, to find, you know, where did my brother get shot out of the sky? Where's his final resting place? And so he went on this journey. And so I interviewed Harold about this, and he told me lots of good stuff and gave me the basic chronology and the layout of the story. But he also had a binder full of material, full of photographs, full of newspaper clippings, and it was just fantastic. And I got out my iPhone, and I use my iPhone a lot when I'm working on whether it's a profile story or any magazine story. And I just start snapping photos because it's great material. You know, here's pictures of him in the 1940s. Here's some details of his war service. So here I've got his birth date, I've got when he was discharged, I've got, you know, what units he served in, all that kind of stuff. Just a lot of details that will help me later on tell this story. And these are details that it doesn't occur to him when I'm interviewing him to necessarily bring up. In this case, again, when you have somebody who has basically done the work for you, run with it. And in this case, the family had put together a chronology of sorts about Eldon Curl's life. This is the brother who was shot down. And in this chronology, they included details about where he was when. They included excerpts from letters that he sent home. And it's probably 5 pages or something, but gave me a really good idea of what happened in a really concise way and gave me a lot of color for the story. This was awesome. When I found this, I was giddy. This was a letter from somebody who was in the plane that Eldon Curl was in when it was shot down. And this is a letter that this other airman had sent home describing the situation and describing what happened. He's writing this to Eldon's parents. And just to give you an idea of what the kind of stuff you can get in this kind of thing. This is an excerpt from the letter. For a split second, I heard cannon shells hitting us and exploding. The aircraft gave a sudden lurch, and at the same time, I felt a blow on my right leg. This occurred at approximately 8:30 p.m. And this is incredible. When I interviewed Harold, I got the general idea. He told me, Eldon was shot out of the sky. His plane was hit. It was shot down. But I didn't have anything near this kind of detail. And so now all of a sudden, when I'm sitting down to write this story, I can describe cannon shells exploding. I can describe the second, what that moment was like. I can describe the aircraft lurching. All of a sudden, this scene comes alive in a way that it didn't with the interview alone. I want to show you another project. This is a story I wrote just a few months ago about a Calgary man who had cancer and basically went into a deep depression as a result of his cancer treatments. The radiation treatments zapped his thyroid, and he went into a deep depression and ended up robbing a bank. And this was he's a family guy, a softball dad, very involved with his kids. They're, upstanding, your typical Calgary family. And he had done this extraordinary thing and committed this crime that brought his family into the public limelight. And again, I met with Rocky, and we met at Denny's, and he told me his story for probably about 2 hours. And again, in this interview, I let him tell his story. But I needed to get more, and there were a few key documents that I needed because this was a legal case, so I knew there was an agreed-on statement of facts. And I knew that I needed this because it would give me a lot more material. It's just like the binder of material that Harold Curl showed me. So I got a hold of the statement of facts, and here's just to give you an idea of what I got from it here. It let me know that when he robbed the bank, he parked in front of the Berwick, a British pub. So all of a sudden, he's not just going to a bank and robbing it. He's pulling his car in front of the pub. When he robbed the bank, he walked in and he was pretending to talk on an orange LG cell phone. And I love that. I love the level of detail. I love that the brand of the cell phone is there. He drove a blue 2003 Pontiac Sunfire. Again, I love that. Anytime you can, name the brand, because all of a sudden, as a reader, I'm not just seeing a car, I'm seeing a Pontiac Sunfire. And he's not just holding up a bank. Now that I have the statement of facts, I have the hold-up note which says, I have a gun, put all the money in the bag. So there's more, there's a lot more detail, and it allows you to tell the story in a more compelling way. Another piece of information that was very, very important in this story, was the victim impact statement. In this case, it was quite an extraordinary victim impact statement because the bank teller that he robbed basically said, I have had nothing bad happen to me as a result of this, and the experience actually motivated her to get involved and to learn more about mental illness and to become more active in helping people with mental illness. So this is a very extraordinary and unusual circumstance. And I wanted to get that victim impact statement so I could include it. And in fact, for this story, I included the entire thing in the story just because it was so good and just so compelling. Just to give you some background, I got both of these documents from the lawyer of the family, of Rocky's family. And, to get a hold of that, it took some back and forth, some phoning. And again, you're saying, here's what I'm working on, giving as much detail as you can. and trying to build trust and say, you know what, I want to tell this story as fairly and in a compelling way. And I'll often tell people, you know what, this is a powerful story. I'm researching this story, and it's a powerful story. And to really convey that, here's what I need. I'll show you one last piece of information from this story. Kind of late in the process, actually, I was able to access another binder. I love binders. Anytime you can get a binder from somebody, just take that binder and run. Oh yeah, Heather asked, do you have to give it back? Yeah, you do have to give it back. Don't really take it and run. But in this case, they had the family had compiled a binder full of emails related to this situation, and just for their own records, and just so they could, it's a significant journey in their life, a very difficult journey that the whole family was going through. But they had a binder full of emails. They had a note from Rocky's doctor. After the robbery, he was diagnosed with clinical depression, and his thyroid was totally haywire, and his TSH levels were off the charts. So this doctor's note is in this binder, and it says, the normal TSH level is somewhere in the realm of 6, and Rocky's is at 29.4 or something like that. And again, it's that kind of detail that I didn't get from just interviewing people. And so one of the things in this binder was an email from Rocky's wife a few days after the robbery. She sent out an email to all their friends and family and said, this is without a doubt the hardest email I have ever written. The news is out, as some of you already may know, and it's the unfortunate truth. Rocky's been suffering from depression since his bout with cancer in 2006 and hit rock bottom on the morning of November 2nd. He robbed a bank. And again, this quote was way more powerful than a bunch of the stuff I got in the interviews. And I used it in the introduction of my story because it was so good, and really helped to set up the story and build suspense. Like there's a literary quality to this email. This is without a doubt the hardest email I have ever written. I just love it. We'll keep going here to one more story, and I just want to touch on this one quickly. This is a story that I wrote about my grandfather's boyhood in Nazi Germany. And I don't want to go too much into this one, but I want to show you one thing that I found really useful when working on this story. Basically, my grandfather was sharing with me his memories of growing up, what it was like when there were air raids on their home, and how they would run into the forest and all this kind of stuff. And what we would do is we would sit down in front of his computer, and we'd go onto Google Earth, and we would look at where his house was. We would look at the layout of where he grew up, and it was just awesome. If you look at that line that's like a hockey stick there, that's the path where they ran into the forest to hide during air raids. If you look in the upper right there, there was a Russian prisoner of war camp there. And as I was doing this with my grandfather, and we're looking at Google Earth, and he's identifying these things, he's telling stories. He's saying, yeah, this was the Russian prisoner of war camp, and in evenings when the wind was right, we would hear this choir of Russian voices. They would assemble this impromptu choir, and we'd hear these sad, mournful songs being carried on the wind. And again, it's just that's great material, and using a visual aid like Google Earth can be really helpful in eliciting that. He showed me, here's the railroad roundhouse where my father worked. And again, he shows me this, and that elicits a bunch of other stories, and he's pointing to different things on the screen here, and it really helped a lot. And it's one of these things where you might not think of using this, but it can be really helpful depending on what you're working on. Another thing I do is just ask people, tell me about this. In this case, this is a document that was, it was my grandfather's confirmation certificate. And so I asked him about it, and there's a wild story behind it. He was going to confirmation classes in the city of Dresden, when it was firebombed. He was living in a small town just a few miles outside of the city and actually saw the flames and the firebombing of Dresden. And this document, his confirmation certificate, apparently the pastor clambered into the church as it was burning and grabbed handfuls of documents and saved a bunch of stuff what he could. And this document was one of those things. So very, very interesting stuff. And again, just by saying, tell me about this. What's the story behind this? We'll keep going. First, we'll take some questions if there are some. Sure.
There are a couple of technical questions that I'm going to save till the end. Right now I'm going to ask questions that related to the last bit of information you gave us, Jeremy. So how much time should a writer or researcher allocate for a piece like the Rocky one, for example?
That's a great question. And to be honest, I put way too much time into every story. And to be honest, if you want to do a good profile story, you have to invest in it. You have to be willing to, spend all this time doing this. But it's hard to quantify it. With the Rocky story, I did it over a period of probably a month and a half, mostly on evenings and weekends. And so, if I tried to put hours to it, it would be tough, but I don't know, 50 hours or something? A lot of hours. It took a long time.
Which leads to the natural next question. What should someone expect for compensation for this amount of work and research that you do putting into a piece like this?
Oh, yes. That's always the question, isn't it? No, that's a good one. And, it depends. For a good profile story that involves this kind of investment of time and energy, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for $2,000. And I know for a lot of magazines that's a tough thing to swallow. But if I'm working on a profile story, I'm giving it everything I have, and I do have basic needs and a family and such, and so I think that's fair. It depends what you're doing. If and it's possible to do profile stories that don't require this kind of time investment. You can condense this, but wherever possible. Like, I just love this journey of exploring and spending a lot of time with the material, spending a lot of time with people, and the fact is the reward is in the thing itself. And I wish the reward was more monetary, but it's not.
Very good and diplomatic answer, Jeremy. I have one more question for this section, and then we're going to move on. There's some more questions coming, but I'm going to save those as well. Do you write on spec or assignment, and do interviewees ever expect payment from you, and how do you deal with that? That's actually two questions, but they're from the same person.
No, I've never encountered that where interviewees expect payment. In terms of when to do the writing, I want to have an editor. I want to have an editor's buy-in for the most part when I'm doing a story like this. At the same time, you're out in the community, you're doing things, you're living life, and you're coming across things. So I might do that first interview initially, get a feel for things, and then go to my editor and say, you know what, I just sat down with with this person, and this is a really good story, and here's why. So yeah, it depends, but as a rule, I certainly wouldn't generally put together a story that requires this much time and investment without having some assurance that, hey, this thing's actually going to be published and there will be a check on the way. We'll keep moving here. Let's talk about writing. See, this is the part that that just sucks. Let's be honest. And the research is so fun, and the writing is so immense, and it can bog you down. And at this stage, I'm thinking about ways to get out of the assignment. I'm going into a bleak depression. I feel no confidence, and I'm thinking about, okay, how can I have a conversation with my editor and say, you know what, this story, yeah, I know it sounded real good, but now, like, I've been working on it, and maybe you should do another story, you know? Maybe we can throw together another story really quickly that's real easy. And so, yeah, I take consolation in the fact that this is fairly normal for writers, and I don't have any techniques that will necessarily let you bypass this. You have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, as it were. And so, and just realize that everybody is going through the same thing. And I'm not trying to depress you. We will get more uplifting here. This is John McPhee. He's a writer, just an incredible writer with The New Yorker. And he had a piece in The New Yorker a few weeks ago about writing and about writer's block. And this is what he said, and I love this. If you lack confidence in setting one word after another and sense that you are stuck in a place from which you will never be set free, if you feel sure that you will never make it and were not cut out to do this, if your prose seems stillborn and you completely lack confidence, you must be a writer. I love that. That's, I'm going to like tape that to my computer or get it tattooed on my forehead or something like that. Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott is just an excellent writer, and if you can get your hands on this book, Bird by Bird, do it. She talks about writing shitty first drafts and how that's essential to the process. All good writers write them. This is how they end up with good second drafts and terrific third drafts. The only way I can get anything written at all is to write really, really shitty first drafts, and that's what you got to do. You just got to put something down on the page and start, and it can be awful and it can be embarrassing, but you need building blocks. So just write. Start with something. And what I find helps with this, here is a technique that you don't have to totally be winging it at this stage. What I find is helpful is to conceive or to think of the story as having three sections, three or more sections, but basically like this. You have your first section, which is the lead and the intro. It's setting the scene. This might be a compelling scene. You're explaining why why the reader should care, basically. Section 2, I find, often takes care of itself. That's the backstory. That's the trajectory. You've done a lot of research. You probably have all this material. And, this section, I find if I can get the first part down roughly, the second one kind of takes care of itself. And then the third section is your ending. Bring it back to the present. Sometimes that works. I'm not saying you should do that in every story, but I find often it's helpful to bring it back to the present and maybe look at what's next for this person. If they've gone through a transformative experience, what's on the horizon for them. And why write in sections? And with this section thing, this is how I think of it. When I'm sitting down to write, I'm not thinking of writing a linear thing, a linear piece from start to finish. I think I'm going to write, this story might have 3 sections. It might have 5 sections. But it lets you write without being too linear. So for example, you could write about somebody's childhood without worrying about where am I going to put this section? Or how am I going to weave this into the rest of the story? You can just start writing, and later on, you will flesh it out. The second interview. Okay, so you've done this first interview. You let them take the reins and drive the thing. The second interview is very different. In the second interview, you still want to build trust, but you're way more assertive at this point. You've done some writing. You know what gaps there are in the story, and you have a sense of what needs filling, basically. So as I'm doing the writing, I'm making notes. Okay, I got to ask them about this, got to ask them about this, got to ask them about, I did one interview and, somebody who's worked with them says they have a really hot temper and they're hard to work with. Oh, I got to ask the subject about that and get their response. And as well, in this stage, I'm asking lots of dumb questions, and I'm not afraid of that at all. And honestly, curiosity compensates for many things. If you show earnest curiosity, people will forgive you for not knowing what certain phrases or things mean. As an example, when I was writing about that war veteran, he kept talking about window. We would drop a window from the plane, and he said that a few times. I'm like, what is he talking about? What is window? And so I asked him, and he's like, oh, well, it's chaff, basically. It's, these bundles of aluminum strips that would scramble the enemy radar. So don't be afraid of asking dumb questions. Writing the lead. Let's talk a bit about that, because I find, I get real hung up on the lead. Sometimes you can jump ahead and, get right into the story. But I find I got to sort out the beginning first to kind of set the tone for the rest of the thing. And a good lead, you're looking for what is most interesting, and also what is something that creates questions that the reader will need answers to. So basically, so they can't put it down. We're going to go through a few examples here. Sorry, I need a swig of coffee quickly. This is an amazing story. This ran in the Edmonton Journal a few months ago. Yeah. And yeah, I would say I lied. I said if you take one thing away from this webinar, it's use Scrivener. I would add a second thing. Read this story. It's just an incredible example of writing and a moving and disturbing profile. It's about this rural farmer in Alberta who was just a rage-filled, abusive man, and who ended up getting killed by one of his sons. And look at the lead. Holly Crichton had known for a long time that someone would have to die. That is one heck of an opening sentence. Right away as a reader, I'm locked in. Why does somebody have to die? She keeps going. She hoped her husband would die of a stroke or a heart attack, but expected he would probably kill her instead, pushing her wheelchair down the elevator shaft in their house, or squeezing the life out of her with his powerful hands, as he had almost done many times. There's so much in that lead where, as a reader, I'm sticking with this story. It begs a bunch of questions. Why has he tried to kill her? Why did she marry this guy? What in the world is behind all of this? And I'd also like to point out that this story begins with something that is not an anecdote. This isn't a scene. This isn't Holly Crichton stepped outside and gazed over her farm and reflected on this and that. It's not an anecdote. And I think as writers, we often tend to gravitate toward anecdote, which can work, but not always. And so this is a good example of something that isn't an anecdote that works. This is another great one. This is from a profile of Robert Munch that was published, I believe, last year, the year before. The children's author Robert Munch. And I love this intro because it's almost like reading one of Robert Munch's books, the description of him. Last August, Robert Munch arrived at a Hamilton elementary school with a floppy white hat and sunglasses, which made him look like a cross between a 9-year-old camper and Hunter S. Thompson. He wore a blue cowboy shirt and white jeans with felt pen stains on them, and his 65-year-old face was boyish and unlined. I love that. It's so true to, if you've read a Robert Munch book, that's true to who he is. Right away, it connects me to Robert Munch. Further down in that story, a few paragraphs down, we get into, why do I want to keep reading this story? This happy, animated public version of Munch isn't easily reconciled with his off-stage self. For much of his recent life, he has been an alcoholic and a drug addict and plagued with thoughts of suicide. In May, he confessed most of this on a current affairs program on Global TV, surprising his many fans and surprising himself. And take note, the writer here is recalling what is already public knowledge, so saying, most of you readers have already heard about this. He did this interview on Global TV. What we don't know as a reader is that it surprised himself to come out and say this. So as a reader, there's this behind-the-scenes element that makes me want to keep reading. I'll quickly touch on this. This is Rocky's story, and I just want to give you an example of how I ended up using that research that I told you about before. This is how I kicked off the story. On the afternoon of November 2nd, 2011, Rocky Huff was running late. It was a mild, cloudy Wednesday in Calgary, and he was to pick up his 13-year-old daughter, Keely, from school. To her, the day seemed like any other. She was looking forward to ring at practice. And right away, what I wanted to do, I wanted to give the reader the sense that something is wrong. This is a normal day. It's mild, cloudy Wednesday. His daughter's waiting for her dad to pick him up, but right away there's a sense that something is wrong. He's running late. And I also want to show you the mild cloudy Wednesday. That I got from Environment Canada. You can go back and look at the weather in any place at any given time, which is awesome because you can see, okay, it was 6 degrees and mostly cloudy that day. I used a bit more further down. Keely waited for her dad. An hour passed, then another. Rocky finally pulled up in his 2003 Pontiac Sunfire. Keely spotted her old LG cell phone on the seat in the car. Weird, she thought. It had stopped working a year prior. Rocky muttered something about getting it fixed. And so, again, you can see where I pulled in those colorful details that I got from those court documents. It just adds so much to the story. I'm going to show you quickly one more lead. This is a very memorable story. This is about the students of Jim Keegstra. He was the anti-Semitic teacher who was teaching students in Eckville, Alberta in the early 80s that the Holocaust was a myth. And what this magazine writer did was he followed up on the kids, and he went and spoke with the kids like years later, several years after this all happened. And he opened his piece by describing graduation day for this girl and a description of, again, everything seems ordinary. But then all of a sudden, within a couple paragraphs, he pulls the story in a totally different direction. He's describing high school life. She would go to parties. She would hang out with her friends. And then there were Mr. Keegstra's social studies class with all those new notions and names and dates. Moles only come out in the dark when no one is watching, Dana wrote on exam day in Mr. Keegstra's class. Jews only do their deeds when no one is watching. Blah, blah, blah. And there's a bunch of anti-Semitic stuff in there. And as a reader, the juxtaposition of that normal graduation day and this disturbing essay, again, as a reader, I'm locked in. And he got this material. Again, they were filed in court, and it just added so much to the story. Writing the middle of the story, like I said, I often find this part takes care of itself. Often I just stick to chronology. This happened and then that happened. I don't put it in those terms, but chronology can help you structure a thing in a fairly simple and foolproof way. Sometimes it can get a little boring, though, so I'll play with that. Sometimes you can weave between past and present, have a scene that's current and then jump back in time to a more historic anecdote or something about their childhood that speaks to that point. And as you're writing the bulk of the story, you want to be portraying your subject fairly. So you've earned this person's trust. So you don't want to crucify them, and you don't want to put stuff in there that they have not had a chance to answer to. So for example, if somebody is reputed to be hard to work with, you want to give them a chance to respond to that, and then you include their response in the story. Resist the urge to dump in long quotes. This is something that takes real restraint because it's a very fast way to write. It's a very easy way to get up to a word count. But I often find as I'm writing and rewriting, and I probably rewrite each story I write 10 times at least, you strip out quotes. That's what I end up doing. And it's tempting to put in long quotes, but often they bog down a story, and you lose the sense of voice that you can bring to it. And another thing I want to touch on is often when you're writing, you'll face a dilemma of do you want to put yourself in the story? For example, if you are with somebody and they behave in a certain way, or you ask them a question and they get really uncomfortable, or something that is telling, I don't shy away from inserting yourself in the story and saying, when I asked so-and-so this, here's how they responded. At the same time, you don't want to be gratuitous with this at all, and you don't want to distract from the subject of the story, and you don't want to basically shift the focus onto yourself in any way. Writing and rewriting, like I said, I just rewrite the thing over and over. And Scrivener makes it easy every day. I start a new draft. I copy and paste what I had from yesterday into a draft, which I give the label of today. And I rework the story. I start from the beginning. I take some stuff out. I add in a little detail here and do that over and over. and I end up taking out a lot of stuff with each rewrite. Stuff that is quite compelling and that I've become quite attached to. I'll take it out because it doesn't drive the story forward, and it's important to me but wouldn't be to the reader. The final interview stage is basically a fact check, and you're just making sure that everything is intact, and that basically that you get the story right. You can do this in person. You can do this. I've done it by text message. By this time, I've built a relationship. I've got their cell phone number. We text. Sometimes, honestly, I'll just be texting, so when you, before you went to the bank, did you, what time did you leave exactly? Was it before 10 or was it after 10? Little details like that. And I'm just making sure everything is airtight. And at this point, you are very assertive. You know exactly what you're after. So it's the exact opposite of the first interview. But you do not let your subject read the story. And it's because it's a big gong show if they do. And they'll want to change it. And you just got to ask, you build trust, and you got to ask them to trust you. Quickly, getting unstuck, because we all get stuck when working on a project like this. I use my editors a lot because I get stuck a lot. And so I'll have conversations with them. I'll phone. I'll say, and like I said, I'm thinking of ways to get out of the assignment. So I'll phone the editor and say, like, hey, so you got another story you can slip into that slot? And then we'll get talking. And then, a conversation will reveal a lot. They'll encourage you to take the story in a different direction. All of a sudden, there will be a path which makes sense and is clear. I show my wife everything. She probably reads, I don't know, so many drafts, like probably 10 drafts of each story, and she's sometimes insufficiently appreciative of my brilliance as a writer. I'll show her something, and it's like, no, that doesn't work. That's too sentimental. That doesn't ring true. And it's like, what? I've been working on this for like 2 hours. But she'll give me that insight to, oh no, you do need to tweak it, and now it's way better, and now I can build the next section. And sometimes I find just leave the project, go for a bike ride, go for a walk, just go do something else and come back to it with a new perspective. Finally, and I touched on this before, the payoff in this whole process is not monetary, as we all know. For me, the real payoff is getting the story right. And when you tell a profile story and you do a good job, what you're doing, you're giving people a gift. Like, you're giving your subject insight and clarity into their own life. And you're giving your readers a new perspective on the world. You're giving them something that makes them look at people a little bit differently. And I look at it as a gift, and it's an honor to be a part of that. And all that said, I do think we should be paid fairly, but there's nothing better for me than writing a profile story and talking to the subject afterward and having them say, you know what, that really nailed it. You nailed it. And in fact, I've had people come up to me and say, you know what, you made me think of things I hadn't necessarily thought of about my own life. And I don't know, it's a very cool. It's an honor to be part of that and to be able to give that to somebody. And that concludes the formal presentation. So I see lots of questions in the queue here, so I'm going to hand the phone over to Heather, and we'll get going with some of those.
I think, Jeremy, you should put your wife on the payroll.
Yeah.
So I have several questions. I'm going to ask one for myself first. Have you ever, I just read a profile yesterday, I think it was in the Atlantic, about the designer that took over Alexander McQueen's role after he died. And she was not quoted at all in the piece. My guess is that she didn't want to be in the piece. It talked about how private she was as a person. Have you ever had that experience where the person you're profiling will not speak to you? And what's your advice in a situation like that?
Yeah, I've had that experience several times, and in that circumstance, you're doing everything you can outside of talking to the person. So you're doing as much of those interviews with people who are close to the person, people who have insight into that person as you can. You're leaning heavily on your research. Often with a story like that where you lack their own voice, it becomes more of a backstory story, like, hey, here's where this person has come from. That's assuming you can get some, that background information is available. But yeah, you got to adapt, and in some cases you can only talk to the person once, and it's a little more tricky. But again, the way I get around that and get access and get that second interview is just saying, you know what, I want to get this story right. Yeah, I know I talked to them one time, but I have some other questions, and I just want to make sure I have this right. I just want to follow up. And people respond positively to that when you tell them, you know what, I want to tell your story well. I want to get it right. I want to tell it fairly. People usually play ball with that.
Omar asked the same question at the same time, so hopefully that answers his question as well. I'm going to go back a little bit and ask some questions. We have great questions coming in. So how do you or your wife or friends read serial drafts with fresh eyes? How do you take a fresh approach to a story you've read perhaps 10 times already?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. Like I say, go for a walk, go for a bike ride. Like, put it off for another day. Let's be honest. Writers were very good at procrastinating, and I don't think that's entirely bad. I think procrastinating is in some ways key to the process, and John McPhee writes about that. If you can look up, he did an interview with the Paris Review. If you just Google John McPhee and Paris Review, and he talks about that. He talks about how he would get up and make coffee, and then he would sharpen pencils, and he'd sharpen them until they were down to nubs, and then he wouldn't even write anything till 5 p.m. And you know, in our world, that's looked at as, you know, that's unproductive, you know, that's wasting time. But he says, no, you know what, that's important to the process. I can't write at 5 p.m. I can't write anything good unless I screw around for most of the day.
Jeremy, have you ever received a negative reaction from a subject you've profiled, and how did you deal with it, if you have?
That's a great question, and I'm trying to think of an example. To be honest, I don't know that I've had that experience. I've had it where I don't hear anything, and that's a little curious, because obviously I wonder what that was like for that person to read that story. I wonder if they think I got it right or if they think I, you know, got it wrong. But for me, that's important. Like, and I find I'm able to do it. If you do your due diligence, if you show that you are going to be fair and you want to give them a voice and a chance to respond to everything, they are not upset when they read it. Now, I've had people throughout the process say, oh, I don't think you like me. And that can be a little awkward. Because depending on who you're interviewing, you might get into a little banter and say, you know, I disagree with that. Like, look at this. I'm tempted to name who said that they didn't think I liked them. In fact, I did like this person, but yeah, that can be a little awkward. But again, I show, hey, I want to get the story right, and people respond to that and don't make too big a deal out of it.
Here's a great question from Lori. Have you ever become too emotionally involved in a story, and what did you do about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that happens a lot. You know, it depends on the circumstance. For example, the story about Rocky who robbed the bank. I was able to talk to Rocky's daughters, their teenage daughters, and again, I look at that as a real honor, and there's a trust there. Like, that their family did not have to let me talk to their daughters, but they did. And there was this really poignant moment in the interview. We were talking about, you know, how Rocky robbed the bank and how has this affected your life? What have you taken away from this? All this stuff. And one of the daughters just shared this beautiful story. I asked, you know, what's your first memory of your dad? And like, I still nearly tear up thinking about it. It was such a beautiful moment because she started talking about, you know, her earliest memory was her falling off the swing set when she was a little girl and hurting her arm, and she was just so distraught. And what she remembers is being picked up by her father and like held in that fatherly embrace. And it was just, it was just beautiful. And she's telling me the story, and she's crying, and I'm crying, and everybody's crying. And it's such a beautiful moment. And so I'm going to write the story, and I'm like, I got to get this beautiful moment in there because that was real awesome. But in fact, I had to cut that out because it didn't do anything for the story. And, it's that line about kill your darlings. Like, you think you have these gems that are so brilliant and so beautiful and so golden, but you got to look at your story and realize sometimes and say, you know what? Yeah, this is, it was a powerful moment, but it doesn't do anything for the story, and it would make it too sentimental. Yeah.
Well, that's a good answer. That's actually a question I was going to ask you because I've cut out gems before, and now you've given me permission to. So thanks, Jeremy. I have a question from Omar. He says, what if you have a subject who's asking you a lot to read it and asking for help with something that you're working on? How do you balance the trust that you're building with a little bit of distance?
Is that so? That would be like assuming they want to see drafts, basically. If I steer away from that, I'll always say verbally to somebody, I'll say, yeah, I'll tell you what my story is about. That if they're saying, I want to know what direction it's headed in, I'll tell them verbally. Just showing, once you cross that line into showing them stuff, it just gets messy. You know what? I might show them certain sections, depending. I might show them, and I've done this very rarely when I think back, but yeah, I try to do everything verbally, and I barely use email further to that, just because, I don't know, it gets too much into stuff is scripted and they want to see stuff, and text messages work real well, I've found, when you're dealing with somebody, and it's like, if they text and ask, how's it going, what direction is it going in, I'll be like, oh, it's going good, this is a powerful story. Now tell me this thing, I need to fill in this gap. So, yeah, but I'm pretty firm about that, just because it gets to be a big mess.
So what do you do if you discover an interesting subject via someone close to you, so a spouse or a friend, who doesn't want to be implicated or feels uncomfortable having passed on the idea? I'm not sure about that last part, but let's stick with the who doesn't want to be implicated part.
So is this somebody who the story is about this person, or they're just tipping you off? Like, if I'm thinking...
Oh, I think tipping you off, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is disclosure for yourself. So if you are close to the person that you're writing about, you need to disclose that in some way. So for example, with Rocky's story, I work with Rocky's wife at United Way of Calgary in the area. And so, okay. And so I disclose that in the story. If it's somebody who does not want to be identified, I honor that. And yeah, Heather's smiling here. I don't know what about. Oh, there's some joking around.
He asked me about only interviewing on Twitter, and I totally fell for it. Jeremy wants to say something about that.
You know what? I wouldn't write that off. I'm trying to think what story it was. I think it might have been a story about Mark Zuckerberg. And we've got somebody from Facebook in on this webinar, right, Burhan? He's in California at Facebook. But anyways, the writer included chat conversations, Facebook chat conversations, and it was great. It was great texture to the story and added a lot, actually. And so, yeah, writing on, Twitter and stuff, I wouldn't do it as your primary interview source, but hey, whatever works.
Actually, Burhan from Facebook has a question for us. He asked if you wanted to, he said you've inspired him, which is great, but he also said, can you share something about your first interview or article as anything that you learned from that first experience, or what your first experience was like? Because you've come a long way since then, obviously.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't remember my first, first exact interview and stuff like that. What I do remember is approaching a project like this and having trouble confronting somebody. So, for example, I would have trouble saying if I was writing a story about somebody, and I did do another interview and found out, oh, this person has a hot temper, or they're hard to deal with, I'd have a real hard time going back to the subject and asking those questions. And that's the biggest thing probably that I've learned, is just be forthcoming throughout the whole process. Just like get it all out there, give people a chance to respond, and if you're forthcoming and honest, it comes back to you in a good way.
I have 2 questions that have been asked twice, so I better ask them. The first one is, do you legally have to tell someone that you are recording them?
In Canada, no, you do not. As long as one person on the phone knows that you're recording the conversation, you're all good, and that person can be you. However, I generally like to let them know, just as a courtesy, that I'm recording. And of course, when you're doing it in person, they're aware of that. I don't stick it in my shirt pocket and be all coy and weird about it.
Jeremy, how do you transcribe your interviews? Any tips for speed, organizing, or flagging content, referring back to transcripts? What are your tips?
For organizing an interview, or just organizing the whole thing?
Transcribing it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, especially with these long interviews, that's a great question, because you got to figure out a system to manage that stuff. And so I'll transcribe it chronologically, and then I'll break it into sections. I'll create a new document in Scrivener, paste the thing there, and bust it up into sections with little headings like childhood, work, family, this experience, that experience. And that way I can quickly jump back and forth and pull from those quotes and those recollections quite easily.
Here's a really great question. I think it has to be our last one. Do you ever feel the urge to protect them from stupid things they say, something perhaps homophobic, anti-Semitic, or flat-out ignorant? And then a second part to that question, or something like glaring grammatical errors, or like even an accent, Jeremy. Sometimes I don't know what to do with somebody who has a really strong accent. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Omar. And definitely, again, you don't want to crucify. See, it's a very, very tricky balance. You don't want to crucify somebody in print. At the same time, you don't want to overprotect them and gloss over their faults. And there was a great article in the Globe and Mail, which I recommend looking up, about Fred Herzog, Vancouver photographer. This was probably, I think, last year. And the writer was going to do a story about his photography, and in the course of the interview, he ended up saying some stuff about, were there really 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, and all this stuff. And the focus of the story shifted, and she wrote about that, and it was quite an amazing story, and I think quite fair, but at the same time quite uncomfortable. But I'm not entirely convinced that's a bad thing. It was forthcoming, it was honest, and I think that was a good decision for her to do that. And sorry, what was the second question?
Grammatical errors.
Oh yeah, grammatical errors. I don't see any big deal with cleaning those up. It depends what it is. It can add color and texture. But I don't want, if somebody has trouble with English, I'm not going to portray that in a way that makes them look bad, or, neither am I going to totally rework what they say, but, I see nothing wrong with fixing minor grammatical errors at all.
Jeremy said he'll take a couple more questions, so I am going to ask. Tanis asked, do you get paid by the word, or how do you figure out compensation?
Yeah, generally not by the word, generally just a flat rate, which we agree to quite early on, and that's good because, like I say, toward the end I'm taking stuff out. I'm cutting out whole paragraphs, whole sections, so I don't want to be cutting down my paycheck at that point. So I actually like agreeing on, hey, this is a flat fee. I'll do the story. You'll pay me this much, and that's good.
One question, does your profile writing get better the more profiles you write?
Yeah, definitely, and a lot of it is it's just practice and knowing. You get a feel for things. You get a feel for, um, trusting your own abilities, trusting the interview process. Trusting that, hey, if you talk to somebody, hey, yeah, you can talk to them again. You'll be able to convince them. Whereas maybe when the first few profile stories you write, it might be tougher to get those subsequent interviews, but it just becomes natural, and writing it's just very slow work. It's slow growing as a writer, and you just have to do it, and it's grueling and painful, and I hate writing, but anyways.
We're not going to end there. How do you trust others' opinions when people are obviously subjective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, especially when you're writing about people, of course, it's all subjective. Even if you're writing about, when you're interviewing the subject themselves, that's all subjective. You are weighing all this stuff. This is really the writer's work. To hear all this, to gather it all, and this is why I say you sit with the material, you analyze it, you give it some real thought and reflection, so that you're able to come back with something that is analytical and is balanced and is fair and is informative and gives a really well-rounded portrayal of somebody. So yeah, I think that's key.
This time I mean it. One last question. This is great, all these questions. Where do you find your profile subjects?
Yeah, that's, it's so random. Rocky's story I found at work, because like I said, I work with Rocky's wife. Sometimes my editor will say, hey, we want a story about this person. Okay, that works for me. Sometimes it's from the remnants of a failed story. I did a story about a Vietnamese couple who escaped from Vietnam in the 70s. And the story came about because I was going to do this. I had this idea, I got to do this story about how pho is the standard meal in Calgary now. Vietnamese is like, this is our standard meal. It's not steak, it's Vietnamese. There's a Vietnamese restaurant everywhere. And that's a good story. But I tried doing the story, and it was terrible. It was going nowhere. And so I talked to my editor, and she's just like, just go to one of these restaurants and ask them for their story. And I did that, and started talking to one of the owners of this restaurant, and she just started telling me about her experience coming to Canada, and it was an extraordinary story. So I just said, all right, I'll run with this, and it was really good. So I think that's we got to wrap it up. So thank you guys very much for participating in this, and I hope it was valuable. And if you have follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I should have stuck my contact info on here, but here, I'll